So we've already learned how to iterate over arrays using for each, but we can perform the same looping operation using other types of loops, for example, a for loop. Let me do the same thing using a for loop. I will first say int I is 0, because remember, in arrays, we start counting from 0. So it's the 0th index, 1st index, 2nd index, 3rd index, and 4th index. So we'll go from 0th index all the way to 4th index. So I will say then array length. So we will do the execution of the block, which is going to be right here. So we'll be executing this block as long as this condition is true. Once it becomes false, we'll no longer be executing this block of code. So let's then increment our I, and this should do it. So the length actually will be returned as 5 because there are 5 things in the array, but the index of the 5th element is 4. So it's, once again, I'm repeating this because it's a bit of a confusing concept. So by repeating it again and again, it will make a lot more sense to you and you will remember it as well. So then I will go ahead and kind of say the same thing, console write line, array, and we're accessing the ith index. So in this case, it'll go to the 0th index, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and then 4th, and then on the 5th one, this condition will no longer be true because there is no 5th index. So let's go ahead and run both. In this case, it will stop at the first execution. So let me just rerun this again. And let's look at our results. One five seven nine 10, 157 9 10. Great. So it was the same thing. Now, believe it or not, we can do the same thing with a while loop. Let's go ahead and do that. I will say while, set up the structure, and then I will say int index is 0, and then I will say while index is less than array dot length. While that is true, go ahead and print the ith, or the index. Not in this case, it's not ith because we don't have access to that variable. So it's the index, so array index. Index is the new variable we're using, and I will say plus plus, meaning I am incrementing it. And this will do the same exact thing. Let's go ahead and make sure that that is the case. And you see 157 9 10, 157 9 10, 157 9 10. So I guess the question here is, which one do we want to use in which case? And that's a very good question. Let's start from the while loop. So the while loop, even though we can perform the same type of operation, it actually doesn't make sense to use it for this case, because while loop is made so that it gives us flexibility, so that if we don't have an upper bound, we can give it a condition, and based on that condition, we will loop a certain amount of times until that condition is met. But in this case, we have a set upper bound. That is the length of the array. So using while loop is actually not as clean. It might actually be a bit confusing, because if you were to put your code in code review process and another developer looked at it, they would actually comment on it or just come up to you and talk to you and ask you a question as to why did you decide to use a while loop as opposed to using a for loop or a for each. And your answer will then be, well, I don't know, because that really would be the only answer, unless you had a very, very specific reason for it. But more often than not, it would not make sense. It would just be a code smell, which just stands for code that might need a little bit more working. For cases whenever you have a set upper bound, just the way we have it in this case, while loop does not really make as much sense. So let's get rid of it. So now we're left with for each and for loop. Both of these make sense to use in this specific situation. with a for loop, we have a clear upper bound. We have the length of the array, as I've mentioned before. And so it makes sense to use a for loop. But actually, in this very, very specific case, it makes sense to use a for each loop as opposed to using a for loop. And I'll tell you why. Because for loop gives us access to this variable, which is the variable that we use as the array's index. But as you can see, we're not really using it anywhere else except with the fact that we are accessing the array using that variable. So it's not used anywhere else. We're not doing anything else with it. So the same thing that we can do with for loop, we can do it with for each loop. And we can do it in a much cleaner way. Like, look at the syntax. We don't have to do any of this. That might actually look a bit confusing. But here, all we have to do is say variable and the collection name, and we're done. So for each is a lot cleaner that way. So you would look at for each, and for, in this case, since we're not using the I, or whatever the name of the variable is that you declare, and we decide that, you know what, in this specific case, for each makes a lot more sense. However, if you, for whatever reason, needed the index, right, then in for each, you don't have that information. For each basically goes from the very beginning to the end of the collection, and that's it. But with a for loop, you have access to this variable, so you can do stuff with it. So if we needed that, then we would go with the for loop. Otherwise, stick with the simplest tool that is solving the problem. Don't introduce extra complexity unless you need to. That's another mindset to have whenever you're developing software. And it's a very important one because it will keep all of your applications maintainable and also easily understandable. Because whatever you use is specifically there to solve a problem, as opposed to you unintentionally introducing it because you did not know what it should have been used for specifically. So just to recap, we went over how to iterate through an array using different types of loops. And the other part is that this doesn't have to be an array. This could be a list or any type of collection. And we could have still done the same thing. But remember, whenever you're dealing with collections or arrays and you're trying to just go from the very beginning to the end, it's much easier and much cleaner to use for each. Unless you need to keep track of the index or do something with the index, then use a for loop. And only use while loop whenever you're not sure about the upper bound, as I've mentioned before. But once again, it's nice to kind of remind you about it again and again so you remember it a lot better. And that's it. This is how you iterate through arrays and lists. And before I end the video, let me show you a very quick example on how to do the same thing with lists. I will just say list and say list equals new list and an empty one. And I can use the shortcut, just like in the array, to put stuff into my list. And in this case, it's going to be the same contents. And I can say list with the for each. And see, that's simple. I can switch from an array to a list and it'll do the same thing. And with the for loop, I can say list, and then I can say count, which is basically a different property, but gives us the same thing. And then I can say list and use the variable I to specify the index of the list. And this should do the same thing. Let's actually see it in action. 157,910, 157,910. And there you go. So now you know how to iterate over arrays and lists, and you also know when to use which type of loop.